I'm actually a little bit more excited for Spider-Man Brand New Day after Fantastic Four. I like Shang-Chi. I like Destin Daniel Cretton directing. Let's hope that we finally give Tom Holland a Spider-Man movie he deserves. A movie where he's actually Spider-Man. You know what I mean? Topic for another day. However, speaking about the Fantastic Four First Steps, I've noticed this very interesting discourse that has emerged in the internet for the past few days, alongside, a lot of reviews referring to the Fantastic Four's First Steps iteration of the Fantastic Four. That sounded really redundant. I know, I'm so sorry. I'm talking about, is Reed Richards on the spectrum? Okay, here's my thoughts on the matter. So a lot of people are mostly hinging, their suspicions or, the plausible hypothetical scenario that what if Marvel Studios decided to adapt Reed Richards in this movie as kind of being a little autistic or maybe having Asperger's, being somewhere on the beautiful spectrum? And here's my thoughts about it. I pondered that thought to myself after watching the movie, because I saw a couple of reviews alluding to that before I was watching the movie, before I went in and watched it in the movie theater. And originally, coming out of the theater, I didn't really notice it because I was much more fixated on seeing if they were going to get the Reed Richards character down, in essence. And in my opinion, they hit it to the bone fairly well. They don't really play up his mean or rude or imprudence, or how would you call it? I don't really know. Reed Richards, if you know from the comic, Reed Richards isn't the nicest person in the world, because he's so fixated on his craft, his scientific craft. And that left me thinking, well, if Reed Richards were to be on the spectrum in this new movie, what does that add to the story? I'm all down with representation. Why not? But the more I thought about it, the more it conceptually kind of makes a little sense, given how Reed Richards is usually supposed to act, given his source material. Now, I'm not an expert in the comic books. I'm more so a casual comic book fan and a super fan of the movie iterations of comic books. I love comic book movies. I don't read a lot of comic books, to be honest. I have respect for comic books. I love the movies. That's just me. And from what I remember Reed Richards being in the comics, there are various iterations on where or how you can tackle Reed Richards, and the entirety of the Fantastic Four, actually. There are different versions of the character. There are silly versions of him. There are more serious versions of him. And the Fantastic Four First Steps from the Marvel Studios movie seems to play him a little bit more restrained, a little more... It's much more of a quieter performance than I expect from Pedro Pascal. Not subtle, but quiet. He's not, as expressive, but he is still emoting. Reed Richards in this film is definitely going through kind of like an emotional duel with letting, at least this is from my perspective, a lot of stuff is happening in this movie where Reed Richards doesn't seem to be totally emotionally there. He understands in practice the problems that are arising in the film. However, he's not emotionally there, which fits the character of Reed Richards perfectly. Reed Richards he's supposed to be what Tony Stark is in Iron Man 3. Like this man that's completely consumed by his own anxiety of an impending doom that he has no say in the matter. That's what Reed Richards is supposed to be. That's why I love Iron Man 3, because Tony Stark is also supposed to be that. He's not supposed to be, a 24/7 joke machine. His character is riddled with a little bit of anxiety and guilt constantly. And Reed Richards is, basically supposed to be kind of like a Tony Stark, but, much more smarter and also a lot less nicer or quippier. Because Reed Richards, from essence, he doesn't have time for social skills to be developed. He doesn't have time or even the interest to understand your feelings on any matter if he has a solution that he genuinely believes can help you, or for the greater good, or for the greater good of the galaxy, or in this case, the universe. And so, from that perspective, if we're going to have to assign that label to him, at least it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of like an interesting iteration or a cool take on Reed Richards. We're going to make him on the spectrum. I'm really open to that idea. I like the idea of, because from a retroactive perspective, Reed Richards kind of does seem to be a little bit on the spectrum, even in the comic books from what I remember, and even in the previous films. There are moments, like especially with Miles Teller's iteration of the character, it's kind of like I can see him, kind of like being a little socially awkward. I can see him being a little bit more stubborn than usual. Additionally, because, as a person who's also on the spectrum, it is incredibly rewarding and super exciting to see a main MCU character being on the spectrum and also accomplishing so much in the film and potentially having a very prominent and bright future in the MCU as well. Pedro Pascal is going to be in Doomsday, so that's really cool. My personal thoughts on the matter is I'd like him to be on the spectrum if they're actually committed to really delving and making a point out of it instead of just... there are two sides to that coin, because in one half, I don't really want it to be that, well, let's just say, I don't want really Marvel to make that big of a deal of it. If it was intentional and they do have intentions on, fulfilling or, committing to that characteristic that they decided to add to this iteration of Reed Richards, I would like them to either make a point out of it and not just add it there for tokenism, or reference it to a point where it's like it's a side thing of the character, but still focus on making the character great. So inadvertently, the tokenism, it wouldn't be tokenism anymore. It would just be, hey, this is a really cool character who just so happens to also be on the spectrum. That's much more fulfilling and much more healthier and much more proper representation for our community. That would be so cool. Because it's like, hell yeah, Reed Richards, he has that same mental condition as I am. And look at him. He's out there being a badass. He's out there trying to do his best. He's being a good father. He's being a good husband. He's being a good friend. And also, he happens to be the smartest man in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because in the comics, Reed Richards is supposed to be smart. I think that's really cool. I'm down with it, actually, the more that I think about it. But we are just hinging on that hypothetical scenario because of Pedro's performance being so much more restrained. I feel there's this softness to him and kind of like this antisocial quirk that he decides to elicit, either intentionally or unintentionally. With performances, it is a little bit subjective of what people can get out of it, I personally didn't really see it in my first viewing. I'm just more so, more convinced and more open to it, not opposed to it, given the history of the character and the source material. I think Reed Richards being, autistic, at least to a certain degree, does kind of fit the character and actually does kind of... There's a lot of qualities with, with that level of neurodivergence that does align perfectly with the character of Reed Richards, even from the source material back in even the Kirby comics, from what I remember. That it's like, this is a really organic evolution to this character that I would kill to see implemented. However, either if they're not going to really dive into it, I would love if they don't really focus on it. It's like kind of like a side thing. I would just like him to be, first off, a good character, and then secondary, being a person who shares the same mental condition as I do. Sorry, I burped. My apologies. I think that's really cool. I think the discourse on Reed Richards possibly being on the spectrum kind of makes me excited, because, I'm not the first person to say it, and nor will I be the last, but we are witnessing a very intense social reckoning on various different political, emotional subjects, especially with, mental health, being much more, it's much more, it's not even cool. It's not even hip. It's not even, frowned upon to talk about. It's just pretty much being, hey man, how are you doing? How are you feeling? People are more accustomed now to actually say that in a genuine way. people are much more conscious and much more open to letting you speak your feelings, talk about interesting things. And autism really hasn't been that well, accepted into that fan club, at least until recently, because, the only representation that we've really had is only through memes and shit posts. So Reed Richards being on the spectrum could open the possibility of, society being open to discuss neurodivergency in film in a way that isn't a complete character like The Big Bang Theory, if you know what I mean. I think that's really cool. It's an interesting choice that's hinging on the subjective interpretation of an actor that I'm honestly not opposed to, because it lines up beautifully with what that character is supposed to be. So in a weird way, it's like a match made in heaven. So I'm down for it. I'm down for Marvel Studios in 2029. Fantastic Four, first Dino Nuggies.